Okay, so me holding up Eugene Onegin in the thumbnail is kind of rage baity of me because it is not part of my worst books of the year list or my worst disappointments of the year list. Far from it, in fact. There is a connection though. I feel like I found my perfect soulmate in Eugene Onegin when it comes to how we feel about our recent reads. There is a stanza in here. It's stanza 44 of the first chapter, and I will read it to you in the translation by Stanley Mitchell. So this is about Eugene. And once more given to inaction, empty in spirit and alone, he settled down to the distraction of making other minds his own. Collecting books, he stacked a shelf full, read, not even one was helpful. Here there was dullness, there pretense, this one lacked conscience, that one sense. All were by different shackles fettered, and past times having lost their hold, the new still raved about the old. Like women, books he now deserted, and morning taffeta he drew across the bookshelf's dusty crew. As you can see, I haven't taken quite such drastic measures, and I also do think that my experiences and the frequency of my bad experiences with books is not completely due to my own frame of mind. Some of the books were genuinely bad, conceptually or craft-wise, and this is especially true for the new releases because the quota of bad books is especially atrocious with the new releases. I'm hardly the only one who feels like books are getting worse and worse. But this time it was especially painful for me because all of the new releases that I ended up disappointed with, to say the least, were from authors that I have read and loved in the past. However, I have also had not such great experiences with the same authors, so I should have been prepared, and I was prepared, to be honest. I still wish it had turned out differently, though. So let's start with the three 2025 releases that are genuinely among my worst books of the year, certainly among my highest disappointments. The first one, probably the worst non-self-published book of that I read in 2025 or DNF'd in 2025 is The Hymn to Dionysus by Natasha Pulley. I was prepared for this to suck really badly, and it did. I'm sure that there are stories that can be told inspired by the myth of Dionysus that can be really great if the author knows what they are doing. If they know the source material, if they know history, and ideally if they know the language. There is a lot of opportunity for playfulness here with the Dionysus myth in particular, and somebody who is knowledgeable about the sources and the different periods in history and also the material reality of these different time periods that informed the myth. Somebody who is an expert in all of this, I'm sure, can write a fantastic and highly entertaining story set in this mythological context. However, Natasha Pulley is not that person. It became apparent on the very first page, and I think I gave it until page 30 or 40, and it was a complete mess. And that's where I DNF'd it and resold it and didn't even keep it to hold it up for you now. Disappointing 2025 release number 2 is The Listeners by Maggie Stiefvater, a standalone historical novel with fantasy elements set during World War II in a luxury hotel in Virginia, in the Appalachian Mountains, I think, which is being requisitioned by the government and turned into accommodation for dignitaries and diplomats, etc., of Axis powers states that were taken into custody. Nobody is thrilled about this, as you can imagine, least of all the hotel's manager, who is a woman. And not just any woman. She is a total 2020s girl boss, and she talks like a 2020s Twitter feed. Everything she says is a two-liner, if as much. Everything is a comeback, even if she wasn't attacked in the first place. And with the story going nowhere until page, I don't know, 100, 140, that's where I gave up. And the third disappointing release of 2025 is Slow Gods, a space opera by Claire North. She is the author of my favorite book of 2024 that I read in 2024, which was Notes of the Burning Age. But Slow Gods hasn't been my first disappointment with her. This is set in the far future in which humanity has colonized space and all kinds of different galaxies. It seems to be so far into the future that humanity's origin on Earth seems to have been all but forgotten. Although what's not been forgotten are politics and economic systems of the 20th and 21st centuries. But some of these systems are now under threat because the book opens with a message being delivered that a sun or a two-sun system is going to explode in a supernova or whatever it was in 80 years' time. So eventually an evacuation will have to be done of at least the innermost planet in the star system. So this is actually a pretty gripping premise. It's stressful from the get-go, or it should have been. The thing is the nature of the narrator. It's first-person narration, and the character who narrates the story is... there's something about his nature. He went through a pretty significant transformative process that is directly to do with the evacuation plotline. And the result makes him pretty disaffected. And to be honest, the most boring imaginable character through the eyes of which you could witness a story like this. And he didn't make me feel any reason why I should follow his story and why I should care for any of the people that appeared in the story, or indeed himself. So I gave it until page 50 and I still didn't care by that time, so I DNF'd this one as well. So 3 new releases of 3 of my favorite authors that I had been looking forward to quite a lot, and all 3 of them were total duds. So that alone would make for a hugely disappointing reading year, but you ain't heard nothing yet. Another huge disappointment was The Price of Spring, the 4th and last book in the Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham, which started out so promising with A Shadow in Summer, and then lost a little bit of appeal to me with the 2nd and 3rd books, but then took a nosedive with The Price of Spring. A, because The Price of Spring is mind-numbingly boring, and B, it's also fucking insulting and infuriating. Abraham basically demonstrates why the men in this fantasy world are quite right in denying women access to the kind of education that would enable them to do magic. Because apparently all that women can think of is babies. And if they can't have babies, they go raving mad and they destroy the world. So, yeah, better keep them in the kitchen, quite right. Next we have The Warrior's Apprentice by Lois McMaster Bujold, the first and last book I read in the Volkosigan saga. I loved the character premise. The main character of at least a part of the series, Miles Volkosigan, has a disability. He has a whole set of physical handicaps because his mother was exposed to poisonous gas during pregnancy. And this is such a nice change for an adventure series like this. The main character is not this uber hero, but actually has obstacles to overcome, which will make it especially difficult for him to achieve his goals or whatever fate throws in his path. The problem is that this premise is made in the beginning and then it never poses any serious obstacle for Miles, presumably because he is such a genius that any physical traits don't even come into the equation. But then I wonder, why are they there in the first place? So why build a character like this if you are not going to do anything with it? So that was such a sad waste of premise. And it also made for quite a boring read because everything always goes swimmingly and there are no major setbacks. So it was just a straight line from point A to point B. That's what reading this felt like. And yeah, I'm not going to waste my time with any more of that. And then we have Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neuvel. A big dumb alien object found underground. The problem with this book is that it is written in interview style, which of course puts some constraints onto what the characters in a very official interview situations, we're talking police or secret service, I don't remember what exactly it was. There are some constraints as to how you can make the characters talk in situations like that, what you can have them say and tell each other. But the author didn't care for any of those constraints. And I'm sorry, but if you don't intend to abide by the rules that your form imposes, then I don't know, you can either not use this form or you've written a bad book. I mean, some people might find it entertaining, but that doesn't change the fact that it is a badly written book. Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky, my second and last book that I tried and DNF'd by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Wouldn't even have picked it up if I didn't already have it when I read and DNF'd the first book by Adrian Tchaikovsky also this year. But Guns of the Dawn is a flintlock fantasy, I guess, set in an Edwardian England-like fantasy world. And it is just 600, 700 pages of nothing. You know how in fantasy novels, usually looking at the fantasy world should feel like looking through a keyhole. You can only see part of it, but you know and are aware of that there is a bigger world than what you can see. And the author, a good author, makes it so that you can feel that there is more and that you trust that there is more. Not so with Adrian Tchaikovsky, at least not in this book. It felt lazy, it felt derivative, it felt like a particularly lazily conceived and executed historical romance novel. And in this regard, the other book that I read by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which was Dogs of War, felt quite similar. So this was my last attempt at reading Tchaikovsky, and I'm kind of glad that I can just disregard him because he has such a huge backlist that I always got a headache trying to figure out which of his books to read first. But this is all in the past now, and genuinely, I think there is a correlation here between the number of books that he puts out and their quality. A very sad disappointment was Mythago Wood by Robert Holdstock, because I've had this on my TBR list for ages, and it also comes so highly recommended and is treated as a fantasy classic, a British fantasy classic. But the premise of this one is that there is this forest in which archetypal characters and personified principles manifest. These archetypes that seem to be cultural constants through all ages that humans use to make sense of the world and of an increasingly senseless world around them. These archetypes and principles, like the warrior, the I don't know, different kinds of gods, the maiden, and these usually appear in stressful times when people are in need of stories and ideas to cling on to. And the times we are in the story is World War II, so inarguably a very stressful time, and the archetypes have begun to appear. However, there's this family that lives on the borders of the wood, the members of which, father and two sons, have learned or are learning to manifest their own ideas in the forest as well. You may already be thinking, this rings a bell. And yes, the whole book does in fact read like Robert Holdstock had read Psychology 101 and went wild with it. However, the wildness in the end didn't translate to the page, because this is the most boringly written story of this kind that you can ever imagine. It is wooden and humorless and just, it's probably an attempt at sounding sober and scientific and then being swallowed by the story, but it just comes across as wooden and completely unappealing. And I was so bored reading this, and I just didn't care what happened to the main character and narrator. And in fact, I found myself wishing that a monster would come and bite off his head so that I could stop being bored to death by him. So this was another DNF, of course. I have one last piece of fiction before I have a couple of non-fiction books to talk about as well. But my last fictional work was such a sad disappointment, in the sense that I was so sad that this turned out to be a disappointment in the end, because it started so promising. And it is To Ride Hell's Chasm by Jenny Wirtz. This started out so great, and was so great for the first half of the book. And so the premise here is that a princess goes missing, and the captain of the city guard is tasked with finding her, and indeed tasks himself with finding her and bringing her home safely, or keeping her safe from her enemies that might lurk inside her own home. And the whole first half of the book is about the city guard captain, about his character, and about the difficult politics that he has to navigate, because he is an outsider to the city and in fact the whole kingdom that this is set in. And Jenny Wirtz really takes her time with character work and with establishing the whole situation. And I really, really appreciated that. And I also appreciated her somewhat idiosyncratic writing style. Her sentences often took turns that I didn't expect, but it didn't feel forced. And I really love when somebody has this kind of distinctive, or at least different, writing style. The problem then was that, having taken so much time in the first half of the book, she then had to kind of go on at the same pace in the second half of the book, which is kind of, it's not really a spoiler, but he finds the princess, and this is only the beginning of the adventure, in fact. And the problem here was that there wasn't enough meat to this part of the story that it was possible to devote as much time to it. And that meant that we got essentially the same scene over and over again, and we went over the same issues over and over again, and I got so bored. I resorted to skim reading large parts of it, several hundred pages in fact. And then on top of that, the ending was hugely anticlimactic, and that made it a disappointment in the end. However, in this case, I would love to read another book by this author, because I really did love her writing style. The thing is that I haven't found a book by her that isn't part of a longer series. If you can recommend me anything by Jenny Wirtz, please drop me a comment. But I don't want to start a longer series having had this experience with To Write Hell's Chasm, because if the series goes the same way, then that would be a huge waste of time. So these were the worst and or most disappointing novels I read in 2025. However, I do also want to mention two non-fiction books that I found especially bad and or disappointing. The first is Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen, which I fortunately didn't pay any money for, but got in a book swap. I don't know how this got even published. Nothing is being explained in this book. Nothing is being contextualized. You can only draw your own conclusions from what is not being said about what actually really happened, what the protagonist or narrator's situation actually really is. And the picture that forms is not exactly the most flattering of her. So the image I got was of an annoying rich girl who either puts herself on a prolonged year of rest and relaxation, or is being put on vacation by her family because she keeps annoying the hell out of everybody around her. And while on vacation, she meets lots of annoying rich girls who are just the same as her. This was really genuinely more awful even than the bell jar. But the worst offender in nonfiction was First Light by Emma Chapman, which is pop science about how the stars formed at the beginning of the universe. I bought this after I had read Tim Gregory's Meteorite, hoping that I would get more of the same. But boy, did I ever not. Tim Gregory takes his readers seriously. He at times demands quite a lot from them, but he is always entertaining. His narrative is there is always a narrative to his explanations, and he is always easy to follow. Emma Chapman is just trying so hard to be, to be quirky about the physical principles and the events in the history of the universe that she is explaining, and she's always trying to lighten the mood by telling anecdotes, and the information just gets buried. And when she does give you information, so having read Meteorite before, I knew just enough to be able to tell that Emma Chapman wasn't telling the whole story, that she dumped everything down to a degree that things didn't even make sense anymore. And all the anecdotes that she told, sometimes they were even personal anecdotes and not even anecdotes from, I don't know, the history of science. So what do I care what you felt like during your pregnancy? Because there is an ever so strenuous mental connection to whatever physical principle you are about to explain. I don't give a shit about your pregnancy or the pregnancy of any other writer whose books I'm reading. I'm here for the physics. Why would I buy this book if I wasn't here for the physics? I wish Tim Gregory had written or was writing more books, more pop science books about astrophysics. Unfortunately, his new book is about why nuclear power is our savior. I hope he goes back to writing about quality topics in the future. I certainly won't be reading pop science books from Emma Chapman again. So these were the worst offenders in what was probably the worst reading year of my life. Now that that is out of the way, we can end the year on a more positive note. Do leave me your worst or most disappointing read of the year in the comments, or feel free to metaphorically bash my head in also in the comments. And I'll see you again probably with my best reads of 2025 in just a few short days. Bye guys.